I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm an artist and sculptor, and in this video we're going to be talking about clay sculpting versus stone sculpting. We're going to be approaching it from the position of a person that wants to have a finished sculpture in a gallery setting or in a sculpture show. We're going to be talking about the process and the pros and cons of each. So if that sounds interesting, let's get into it. This video is made possible by the people that have purchased my online sculpting courses, so thank you, and we'll talk about those courses a little bit later. Whether you're new to sculpting or a seasoned artist, considering the pros and cons of these two materials is crucial, and you might even want to consider switching things up. Let's start by going over clay sculpting, also referred to as additive sculpture, because you're adding the material to reach the final surface of the sculpture. Clay is often the go-to material for beginners and pros alike. There are many different kinds of clay, but the clay I typically recommend to students is a non-dry modeling clay, also called plasticine or plastilina. And that clay can be reused. It's oil and wax based, so it doesn't dry out. You can use it over and over again. And this clay is ideal for mold making and casting. It's not meant to be a permanent sculpture in the clay itself. And typically, the type of material you'd expect in a gallery setting is bronze. So you'd have to go through the process of taking it from a clay sculpture to a bronze finished sculpture, and that's kind of what I'm going to be comparing. Advantages of clay sculpting. First, there's ease of use. Clay is soft and malleable, making it super easy to shape and refine. No need for heavy-duty tools, you just need your hands and a few basic sculpting implements. It's also reworkable, so if you make a mistake, no problem. You just add some clay or remove some clay. Very easy to add and subtract clay from the sculpture or reshape it, and you can do that indefinitely. It's also affordable. Clay itself is relatively cheap, especially when compared to high-quality stone. Where it becomes more complicated is when you want to transfer that clay into a permanent material like bronze, which can be a very expensive process. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. It's also convenient. Compared to a chunk of marble, clay sculptures are much easier to transport and display. It's reproducible, so once you've made a mold, you can cast multiple pieces or multiple editions of that sculpture. So one sculpture can be sold many times. But sculpting in clay is not all nutty buddies and cookie dough ice cream.
Flaky, you get the thinness, you get the peanut butter, the chocolate. Oh yeah.
So here are some of the drawbacks. The disadvantage of sculpting with clay. Mold making and casting are required for permanence. To me, this is the biggest drawback of clay sculpting. So in order to take a finished clay sculpture and turn it into a permanent bronze requires mold making, wax casting, wax chasing, bronze casting, bronze welding, bronze chasing, and patina work. Sometimes each of these tasks are done by different professionals at a bronze foundry, and the process can quickly escalate into the thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of your sculpture and the complexity of the design. The mold making process alone can be extremely expensive when hired out, and it's very complicated if you want to do it yourself. Now, you can bypass some of the cost and hassle of mold making in a couple of ways while still working in additive sculpture. First, you could sculpt in a ceramic clay and fire it in a kiln. This creates a finished ceramic sculpture, which is basically comparable to stone. However, you must have access to a kiln in order to fire your sculptures. Sometimes kiln time can be rented out from local ceramic shops, so you might want to look into that if this is something that you're interested in. Or you might be able to find a kiln secondhand, which are generally cheaper. Another way to bypass mold making is using a sculpting material like polymer clay, which can be baked in a normal oven, or epoxy clay, in which you take two parts of clay and mix them together, and it'll work for a little bit before hardening. Materials like plaster or cement-based clays, which harden into finished sculptures, are also an option. These sculpting materials are typically more expensive and more difficult to work with. These sculptures also typically don't sell for as much as stone or bronze, which have more permanence and weight and durability to them. For more on types of clay, you can check out this video on the Proco 3D channel that talks about different types of clay in more depth. Please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel Hit the notification bell if you'd like to see more videos like this. Another thing to think about is reproduction. So when you do these materials, it makes a one-of-a-kind sculpture, so you're not able to sell multiple editions of the sculpture like you would be able to do if you made a mold and cast it. So when sculptures are one-of-a-kind, that does add some value because the buyer knows that this is the only sculpture out there, so that creates scarcity, and that can increase the value. This is why even with bronze sculptures, where they make multiple casts of the sculpture, they typically do limited editions of 10 or 20, so buyers know that there is some scarcity behind that work of art. Before we get into stone sculpting, let me recommend the Proco Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course, which you can find at proco.com/sculpture. This is the course for learning traditional figurative representation in clay, using techniques that have been given to us by past masters. We go over everything from building proportionate wire armatures to doing quick gesture studies, simplifying the complex forms of the figure into primary, secondary, and tertiary forms, the types of clay, tools for sculpting, how to build your own tools, and we even cover some simple mold making techniques so that you can make those clay sculptures permanent. So it's a great course that I hope you'll consider joining. Once you finish the Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course, I encourage you to move on to the Portrait Sculpting course at proco.com/portraitsculpt. That dives into the anatomy of the head and neck and each of the facial features. And the Hand Sculpting course at proco.com/handsculpt takes on the bones, muscles, proportion, and gesture of the hands. And if you can accurately represent the portrait and the hands, your sculptures are much more likely to find a buyer. Now let's move on to stone sculpting, which is subtractive, meaning that you find the forms by removing material. This means that the sculpting process is basically the opposite of additive sculpture. With additive sculpting or clay sculpting, I recommend starting thin and simple and then slowly building out the mass and complexity with pieces of clay. With subtractive sculpture, you want to start fat and simple and then slowly push in as you remove material and come closer and closer to that final surface. For more on the sculpting process, you can check out the video I did turning a small maquette design of the Queen chess piece into a finished stone sculpture. Stone has been used for centuries to create some of the most iconic art in history. Let's look at some of the advantages. Durability. Stone sculptures can last for centuries. If you choose the right stone, the sculpture can be weather resistant, so it's great for outdoor displays. It's got a timeless aesthetic. There's something undeniably majestic about a stone sculpture. It has higher retail potential. Because stone sculpture is a one-of-a-kind original sculpture, it can typically be priced well above an identical sculpture in other mediums. For me personally, because stone has more weight and presence, I feel more comfortable charging a little bit higher prices, even for more simple designs. There's something about the finish of stone that just feels superior to any other sculpting medium. But with these advantages come some challenges. The disadvantages of stone sculpting. Stone is unforgiving. You make a mistake, and it's not easy to fix. You can't just add the piece of stone right back. So if you make a mistake and accidentally remove some of the material that you needed, well, then in order to fit the design in that same piece of stone,
the design has to get smaller. If you make another mistake,
it gets smaller again, smaller and smaller, and pretty soon you just have this tiny little sculpture
somebody can use as an earring or something. Another thing to think about is the cost. High quality stone is expensive, and so are tools required to shape it. For more on tools, you can watch this video that I did that shows all of the tools I like to use for stone sculpting and the ones that I used for sculpting this Queen sculpture. There's also physical effort. Stone sculpting is more physically demanding. It requires more strength, patience, and endurance. It's also time consuming. It takes much longer to complete a stone sculpture compared to clay. Typically, you'll sculpt a maquette or a small model in clay to use as a reference for the finished stone sculpture anyway. So before you even begin, you've already sculpted that figure in clay. So which medium should you choose? If you're just starting out or prefer something more flexible and affordable, clay is probably your best bet. It's great for learning the fundamentals of figurative representation and finding the forms. It's great for learning anatomy, designing maquettes, and building your skill level. However, when it comes to sculpture shows, I personally have leaned towards stone sculptures because the upfront investment of tools and stone is much cheaper than the investment in bronze casting. And the finished sculpture is able to sell for a similar price or slightly more than bronze depending on the design. If you're up for a challenge and want to create something that's lasting, stone could be the way to go. If you're in the US, 2sculpt.com is a great resource for stone sculpting tools and stone itself. This isn't sponsored or anything, I just have purchased tools and stone from them, and they're great to work with. Can you guys think of any pros or cons that I've missed in this video? If you can, comment those below so that people can see some other things to consider when they're trying to create a finished sculpture that they want to sell. I hope you'll check out my sculpting courses with the links that can be found in the description of this video. Thanks for watching. As always, stay creative, stay productive, and hopefully I'll see you again soon in another video.